Hello and welcome to Sfax. And I mean that. 1884, and this is a French design. So, it's always fun when I started on the French, and this one is going to be particularly interesting because this one is going to be French personified. You cannot get more French, more Juno Cole, more late 19th century cruiser than Sfax, no matter how hard you try. You can't get more than it in any way, shape, or form, in fact. It's because it is so French and so 19th century cruiser that I am drinking La Coca Cola from a wine glass in honor of this very individualistic ship. And yes, I have swapped sides, but the room I'm in is interesting. I'd have to completely rebuild the entire room to go back to my now normal side. So I'm back to my old normal side. This is her as originally configured. Now, the Sfax has an interesting story. It all starts with Louis Emile Bertin in 1870 making a study and going, this is the cruiser we need to build. Unfortunately, he, how do I put this politely, proves unable to sell it to the various people for, well, roughly 12 years, give or take. And it actually waits until the guy who is director of works and in charge of these things goes off ill. And the person who replaces him, Bertin, manages to be convinced that his study is very good and is a far better fix for the French Navy, the Marine Nationale, than the ships they were actually building at this point. Which isn't hard to sell because the ships they were actually building at this point were, well, they were frankly terrible, but this was not much of an improvement. She's laid down on the 26th of July, 1882. She's launched on 26th of May, 1884. She's commissioned on the 17th of January, 1887. I do not know why they didn't wait an extra 9 days to commission her so that everything could have been on 26th, but you know, they're French. They don't understand tradition, and you know, it's just part of their problems. And they actually decommissioned her on the 13th of August, 1905. Again, waiting just 13 days. Was it really cost a lot to keep her in commission for another 13 days? No. She's stricken in 1906, and, well, she's broken up in 1910. Sad times. But no, Bertin, how he gets her is, well, the guy who didn't like it goes off ill and then gets replaced by another gentleman. And the new gentleman, well, let's put it this way, he is more emotionally forgiving to Bertin than Victorine Sabatier had been. So Alfred Lebel de Dion accepts his idea. And his the proposal he started off in 1870, they actually, the design they tend to say is it comes from his 1873 design, but really it's not. It's been heavily upgraded by this point. And, well, you'd expect it to have been. It's been almost 9 years since it had been originally designed. It's been played around. And then, whilst he then takes that design to the new French Minister of the Navy, Georges Charles Jouclou, and persuades him to cancel a vessel known as the Capitaine Lucas in favor of this, which is called the Sfax. The well, how do I put this? The very important at this point, the incredibly important Conseil de Travaux, or Council of Works, make several changes and improvements to be suggested. So this is not the Bertin design. This is not the Bertin design of 1973. It's not even the Bertin design of 1873, or not the Bertin design of 1881. It is the modified Bertin design by the French Marine Nationale's processes. And it's important to realize that this is the point at which that particular Conseil de Travaux is its most powerful. And they are very, very powerful at this point. And this is the vessel which ends up getting ordered. And why it matters so much is, and why I call it the most French and the most, cruiser of this period, is because the French build it. It looks so great on paper to them in their idea that they then base every subsequent cruiser they build off it for many, many years. So, despite it being technically a class of one, it becomes genesis point for an entire series of classes, often of single vessels. And this means that, again, the French get ships which look rudimentarily like each other, but are actually a series of very different ships, which makes operating them together an absolute blast. Quite literally. As in things going boom. So let's consider the board of construction, the Conseil de Travaux. Now, formed in 1831, disbanded in 1905 in favour of the Committee Technique, or Technical Committee. It was part of the Ministry of Navy, charged with examining projects relating to warship construction and dockyard infrastructure. This included evaluating projects, plans, cost estimates for warships, preparing the instructions for building new ships, preparing the documentation for competitive proposals and tenders, evaluating new inventions submitted to the ministry. It made them incredibly powerful. Now, this power is formalized in that by towards the end of the period, the Minister of Navy would send any proposals that were submitted by the Superior Naval Council to them for them to critique. This ends up creating a problem because often they get branded as being more conservative than the admirals on the Superior Naval Council, and this is causing there to be a logjam in bit of construction, and therefore they are got rid of in 1905 in favour of the Committee Technique, or Technical Committee, which has less power and less ability to change things. I would actually say it's that this committee are probably the bastion of the people who are going, the Junicol's not working, we need to be more practical. They're the ones who regularly shouted out at ministers about the need for actual infrastructure and investment and cross development of sites so that they can mutually support each other. All those things which are incredibly annoying to ministers who don't want to spend money on this stuff. So, yes, they're often branded by many authors, and I do understand where the authors are going with this. They're saying they're conservative admirals, they don't want to go with the new technologies, they don't want to do this, that, the other, and I can agree with exactly what they're saying on that. And they do come across that, but I would also say there is a large argument made that those admirals are more about making the case of we aren't doing what we've already got well or correctly at the moment. There is no point jumping into a new frying pan when we haven't sorted out the fire we're in. It's just not going to work. So, yeah, it's not a fun time to be the Council de Travaux. But in the 1880s, they're at the height of their power. They've been going for nigh on 50 years. They have all the legacy and bureaucracy behind them now. They're well wedded into all the systems, and they have their most powerful members. And that's the problem, really, because when they're trying to implement the full Juna Coal, Bertin. He puts forward this design. His design is radical, amazing, it's glorious. But when you look at it and you compare to Sfax to as built, to the Milan, which is the sister of the ship it replaced, the Capitan, there are a lot of similarities going on there. It's almost as if they took the idea of Batan and they went, yeah, but here are some ideas which we know work. So let's include let's build it around this. Let's fuse the parts which we think will work of his proposal with the things we know work from the design ships we're already building. And do produce a fairly decent, if not world-setting alight design. And if I got my slides in the right order, yes, I have. Here's the Sfax. Now, please notice the ram bow. Please also notice there's a slight difference in the sailing rig. Sfax comes out with a bark style rig. And also notice the funnels. This one is designed very much with two funnels again, but the bridge and command structure is built around the second funnel. On this vessel, it is freestanding, and the two funnels themselves are freestanding. It's quite an interesting design. Ram bow, well dispersed gunnery, well dispersed firepower. It's a fairly capable ship. It's a well designed little ship. So this displacement 4,888 tons, length 96.08 meters. That's 315 feet in old money, 3 inches. Beam 15 meters, 49 foot, 3 inches. They like things having 3 inches more. Draft 6.77 meters, that's 22 foot, 3 inches. Now, as I said, the sailing plan was a bark rig. They had 12 fire tube boilers, supplied 2 compound steam engines to generate 6,495 indicated horsepower, not shaft horsepower, indicated horsepower, for 2 shafts, each driving a screw propeller. Please note they're driving a screw propeller. The French at this point did try and experiment with other styles of propellers, but they seem to keep coming back to the screw propeller, so something sensible is going on. There is advantages to other types of propeller design, there certainly is, but if you're going to make anything work with metallurgy of the time in the 1890s and 1880s, and screw is probably the best way for you to go. It requires a very finely tempered blade and a very finely tempered and balanced propeller to make most of the other designs of propeller work. Whereas a screw propeller you can do pretty well with fairly rudimentary metallurgy in comparison to what we do today. Range 4,200 nautical miles at 10.5 knots. Now, that is, I presume, based on her coal supply. Because theoretically, sailing, your range is infinite, of course. Just when you run out of water and food, the squidgy organic bits tend to suffer. And of course, she's carrying 470 of those. So you can't forget the squidgy organic bits. They matter. Top speed under power is 16.71 knots, but I'm fairly sure that uses up coal like it's going out of fashion. Armament, 6 164mm guns. That's a cool one to say, 164mm guns. 10 138mm guns, 8 37mm guns, and 5 356mm, it's 14-inch torpedo tubes. Now, later in life, the secondary guns, especially the 37mm, will be get replaced, additioned, and played around with as they work out what's best for boarding actions. And the torpedo tubes, eventually she ends up with only the broadside ones remaining. But she still retains her armor. and the deck is 30 millimeters of armor. The conning tower is 30 millimeters of armor, and the sponsons have 8 millimeters of armor. Cute. Very cute. Now, in case you're wondering about the torpedoes, 2 fire forward, 1 each side, and 1 firing sternwards. It's always nice. She also carried some 65mm field guns that can be sent ashore the landing party. Again, this is very much a ship which is supposed to be a cruiser. It's supposed to be a world-present ship. And some of these things have been added in despite Bertin's original plans. And Bertin's plans call for something which is far more focused around the commerce raiding and commerce interdiction side of the cruiser role rather than the more general purpose parts of the role. And there is something I have to admit here. There is a point I often talk about when I talk about cruisers that a cruiser can do these things. And it's true, there is a range in roles and there are many duties a cruiser can be called upon to do. But a cruiser doesn't necessarily have to do all those roles to be a cruiser. You can build a cruiser and focus it in on a couple of portions of its duties, and just it can do the others in name only or not at all. There is, to an extent, you're building a cruiser-sized vessel to do that role in the way a cruiser would. And it's rather than coming up with lots of different names for ships, we still call it a cruiser. We wouldn't want to do X, Y, or Z, but it'll do A and B absolutely amazing. And it goes back to the whole debate about generalists versus specialists. This comes up a lot in naval discussions. Is a Navy best to have is Navy best to have a load of specialists or a load of generalists? There are lots of different competing views on this. My own view tends to come down to how big is your Navy. If you have a Navy of 400 ships, and you can therefore afford to say, well, I've got anti-submarine warfare ships, air defense ships, and land attack ships, and I'm going to have 150 anti-submarine warfare ships, I'm going to have 150 air defense ships, and 100 land attack ships. Well, let's say you used a rule of 5 rather than a rule of 3 to generate, and that guarantees you 2 forward. You're pretty much going to be able to call upon 40 land attack ships, 60 anti-submarine warfare ships, and 60 air defense ships at any one time. That's still that's a fairly good force. And you'll probably be able to form some balanced task groups out of that. Yes, you're going to have to be scrabbling because it's not always a guarantee they're going to have to be in the right place at the right time, but you can do that. However, if you have a Navy which is 40 ships rather than 400, well, then you have a problem if you start dividing into 15, 15, and 10. Because even if you're using the rule of 3, you have 5 available, and 3 available. Well, that's going to be a little bit harder to guarantee you're going to be able to form a balanced task group, isn't it? It's going to be a little bit tougher. And that's the point at which you go, well, 100% solution is great. But if I have 40 ships and I build them as all-rounders, so that they're a 75% solution in any task, and then from those 40 ships, I usually have a third available. I should have made it and done, but it's all by 3, shouldn't I? But let's say it's, because it's starting off for the 400, I went with 40. You then would go, right then, how many do I have? Usually I have 13, 14 ships available, probably, let's be honest. Well, that's good. Because if I have 14 ships available, I can probably form 2, maybe 3 task groups and have enough escorts. Because if you consider the previous option, where I had 400 and I was forming up task groups, I'd probably be forming them up as, well, 2 to 3 air defense, 2 to 3 anti-submarine, and a couple land attack. So that's 8 vessels. That gives me 300% for air defense, 300% for anti-submarine, and 200% for land attack. But let's say I take 5 vessels from my 14 ships available to form up my task group, and they are 75%. Well, they're all 75% in air defense. So I've got 5 times 75%. Ooh, well, okay, they're not going to be quite the same as the 300% offered by those earlier vessels, but technically that's 375%. So that's technically better for air defense. Same for anti-submarine warfare defense. Oh, and land attack. Now, what is the reality of that? Well, the reality is it's probably going to mean as good as they are as air defense, their weakness is probably going to be the number of missiles they're going to carry. So you might well find the 300%, the 100% ships will carry more missiles. So you're dependent on the missile load across 5 ships for that air defense. And it's the same with the anti-submarine warfare, but there again, they're all going to be carrying. So let's say your ASW ships tend to carry 2 helicopters, and your air defense ships all carry 1. Well, all your ships might carry 2 helicopters. So that's 10 helicopters. Whereas your 8-ship group would be carrying 6 plus 5 more, so 11 helicopters. It's a difference, but it works. It's 1 less, but it's still enough. What I would say, the difference between Bertin's design and the design that's chosen for Sfax is that this vessel comes out is far more towards being a 90% solution for the commerce interdiction role and a 75% solution for everything else. And that's another thing which is quite common. You can build a vessel which is an all-rounder, or you can build a vessel which is a devout specialist, which is 100% for one mission, or you can build a vessel which is emphasized to one mission, which quite a lot of modern Western navies especially do. They build ships which are generalist, so they're able to fill in all the other roles to a certain level, a certain degree. They're able to carry marines, they're able to do anti-submarine warfare, air defense to a level, but they have an emphasis, a specialism that is the core capability they provide the fleet. The Royal Navy is a good example of that, but so is the modern Marine Nationale and the Italian Navy. So it's worthwhile thinking about that. And I would argue that is what Sfax is. She is an emphasized vessel, but not emphasized at the expense of not being able to do the other roles if needed to. Now, she's of course constructed at the Arsenal de Brest, traditional cruiser construction facility, and she's named for the conquest of Sfax in Tunisia, which had taken place in 1881. Always nice to know you're naming places after colonial conquests. It's quite a common thing in this period, and it's basically another way of nations showing off in international relations terms how powerful they are, going, look at where we've conquered. Look at all the pieces of red we have on the map. Yes, international diplomacy has forever been, at least in part, I'm bigger than you, mate. Sad as we might find it, it is always the case. There is always a healthy part of it now. Now, her sea trials were conducted off Brest, and they were conducted between the 17th of January 1887 and the 7th of June. She was placed in commission 8 days later. She did that well on her sea trials. And then she sent to Toulon and the Mediterranean. She sent there to participate in the fleet maneuvers in the Mediterranean Fleet, and after she's done that and taken part in those exercises, rather like many of the British crews at this time, she's placed in reserve. Remember, this is something which is quite common. It's only today that we have navies which operate on the idea that A, every ship has to be a first-class, all-or-nothing amazing warship, and B, all our ships have to be in service, including our modern ships, all the time. It used to be quite common to have ships which were brand new, which would take part in exercises, and then would go to dock and be sat there for sometimes years, not being used because they were built to be used in a war if they were needed in a war, not to be run into the ground in peacetime. You needed to have enough ships to do your peacetime duties, but it was realized there was a difference between what your wartime needs would be and your peacetime need to be. And actually, it makes sense to preserve some of your first class ships in reserve because whilst you want to use them, you and to learn how to use them as well, you also want to preserve some of them so you preserve their capabilities for if you need them in wartime. You want them to be available quickly. So you'd have some navies which would have as much as 50% or more, usually roughly 50%, of their fleet would be in ordinary rather than in commission, which means they'd be stored, they'd have a skeleton crew on them for maintenance and for keeping them going. And in wartime, or for major exercises, they'd get a captain, they'd get a full crew of reservists drafted aboard, and they'd go off and take part in exercises. And that was an era when we didn't have virtual learning and all the other facilities we have today to actually make it easier for people to practice their jobs when they can't go to sea. It's amazing. In fact, as a rule, she spent most of her life in reserve. Um, it's 1890 when she's transferred to the Northern Squadron, based in the English Channel, took part in that year's manoeuvres. Remember, she's been in reserve since 1887, since after the manoeuvres then. She'd done a couple of outings to other exercises, but that was it. She took part in 1890s manoeuvres, along with Marengo, Ocean, and Suffren, and the torpedo cruiser Epervier. The whole point of these maneuvers were to involve the ships in attacking coastal defense ships and armored gunboats in what was supposed to be a simulated amphibious assault on, what was presumed to be a German squadron on the defending French squadron represented by the coastal defense ships. The exercise concluded on the 5th of July, and the Northern Squadron had failed to neutralize the defending forces and effect a landing, which was found to be a great win for it. However, there were many people who pointed out that these exercises had some very interesting stats given to the defending forces, and there were several severe weaknesses imposed on the Northern Squadron and the maneuvering points. I'd also add, personally, having looked at the results and looked at the things that were going on, they were probably right to make their assessment, but they were also assessing it based on slightly improper data, in that they were still using their ships as their ships, rather than if you want to really simulate a German or Eastern squadron attacking your force, you need to give them the stats and operational capabilities of that squadron. You can do that artificially with marshals and various other things in an exercise. That would have made a lot more sense and would have probably given them a slightly different result. I still think the defensive forces might have won on the stats they'd set up, but probably not as easily. German ships tended to have more armor and more reliable engines at this point, which would have affected operational capabilities. After this, well, in 1891, there were joint maneuvers between the Mediterranean Northern Fleet and Northern Squadron, and the exercises took place from the 6th of July to the 25th of July. These are quite a long period of exercise. If you think about it, that's 19 days. So it's nearly 3 weeks. And that's, again, how they were able to keep a reserve fleet. It wasn't just the reservists will get called up, they will do a few hours. No, reserves will get called up. You won't be able to fire them from their jobs, and they will have protection. They will go to sea for 3 weeks. Now, Is it a universally great system? No, but as mentioned, they don't have access to all the things we have today that we could employ to try and make it work and actually improve things. In 1892, she went back to the Mediterranean Fleet, and there she was attached to the reconnaissance force for the main French battle fleet, along with the Taj, the Amiral Cecile, and the Lalande. She, of course, took part in that year's exercises. But by 1893, she'd been reduced again back to reserve squadron, and, well, she spent 6 months of the year on active service with full crews for manoeuvres, and the rest of the year was laid up with reduced crew. That's how the reserve squadron was managed. And she took part in pretty much every single major exercise and many of the minor exercises for her entire career, including in January 1895 when she took part with the Admiral Dupré in an experimental bombardment of coastal fortifications on Levant Island. It lasted 6 hours and was carried out over the course of 3 days. So those 6 hours were spread over 3 days so that the effects of the shelling could be studied, so that they could work out how viable these ships were at bombarding land targets. Now, this is her after her major refit between 1888 and 1889. So she'd had a major refit a couple of years after entering service. Changes her look a bit. This is before, though, her next major refit, which was 1897 to 1898. Remember, this is a vessel which is stricken in 1905, scrapped in 1910, yet has a major refit in 1897 1898. Because this is a period of technological change, and this ship still looked viable at that point and was worthwhile investing in. But within half a dozen years, the world had changed. Tsushima had happened. Dreadnought had happened. The Invincible class were happening. The world was looking weird. Jackie Fisher was making a lot of bombastic statements, and we can all be sad that there wasn't Twitter in the early 1900s, because that would have been an absolute gold mine for modern naval historians if Jackie Fisher had had access to Twitter. Interesting enough, during that bombardment, neither ship was able to damage the fortifications that well. The French therefore determined that any attempt to neutralize fortifications would require an excessive amount of ammunition. It would be almost impossible to do so. I, again, don't really agree. I think they sent ships which weren't really suited to the role, and especially when you consider the elevation and capabilities of these ships' guns. But I can understand why they're getting at. There are a constant battle between defense and offense in terms of capabilities, and shore defenses versus sea defenses. And it is something which always has to be factored into when you're thinking about these things, because whenever you presume everything's gone one way and now there is no change, no possibility of changing it or reversing, is usually when it slips back the other way, and then it looks like there's no chance of doing that. When you consider when the French first built fortifications along their coast in the Napoleonic era, the British response was to go other places on the coast and land elsewhere. You've built a fortification there, great. We'll land. We will land elsewhere where you don't have troops. Okay, you're going to have mobile artillery. Fine, we'll bring along ships with bigger guns, and you can move in your mobile artillery. And it's a constant tactical, strategic, and technological battle where one side will come up with a counter, one side will come up, the other side will come up to counter that counter, and then it carries on. In 1895, she takes part in the fleet maneuvers where the French fleet, Fleet A, and Fleet B were tasked with defeating Fleet C, which was supposed to be the Italian fleet. 1895. Yes. The Franco-Italian relations were really good at that point. Another point to remember when we're talking about World War One, there are lots of potential options for how that war could have begun and which sides could have been fighting which. Now, one of the interesting things is that it's between 1898 and 1899 that, in addition to repairs of her machinery, she has her military masts replaced with pole masts, and she's assigned again to the North American Squadron, along with, of course, the unprotected cruiser Doobadoo. She actually finishes off her career pretty much with the most famous event of it, in that she is the ship sent to carry back Alfred Dreyfus from Devil's Island in French Guiana to Port Helgen. Now, if you want a good account of Devil's Island and French Guiana and the French penal system at the time, might I recommend Papillon? It's a wonderful book which I first read when I was 6. I am still to this day not quite sure how the various people came to give me that book when I was 6. I'm not sure if any of them had read it. But it's a very good book, and it's well worth understanding the French penal system, and that was around at that time. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, cruisers like Taj and others which come after her are increasingly based upon her. They are improved versions, modified versions of Sfax. As you can see, Taj here, she has a third funnel. She has far less mass, although this is post a refit. And she's starting to turn into something which is looking sort of like pre-Dreadnought era, which I always find a very interesting phrase. Someone did comment the other day and went, in the pre-Dreadnought era, they didn't realize they were the pre-Dreadnoughts, so they just called things battleships. And that's correct. They just call these ships cruisers. Some of them are referred to as armored cruisers, but most of them are referred to as protected cruisers, or the first, second, and some navies even had third class protected cruisers. Other navies flirted with calling those things sloops. What can I say? It depends on your personal preference. Sfax has a massive legacy in the French Navy because if you're talking about a vessel which makes part of the Junocol strategy work, it's Sfax, theoretically, with her range and her speed. Although, and here is the real problem. So, Sfax is built in 1884. Now, the Leander class, who I've already discussed in this series, they also have a speed of 16.5 knots as designed, but it's 17 to 18 knots after their funnels are raised. So they're faster. They're capable of 11,000 nautical miles at 10 knots, so they're capable of longer range. And they have 1.5 inches of steel armored deck with slope sides and a 1.5 inch gun shields. So they are faster and more heavily armored, and whilst they have less indicated horsepower, they also carry 10 6-inch guns. Now, the point I'm trying to make here is this. Yes, the Sfax carries 6.5-inch guns. She carries 6 of them. But once again, it's the French launching a ship which is supposed to be their commerce raider. They launch one, and they launch it 2 years after the British have already launched the Leander class and are moving on to the next class, and the class after them, and the class after them, which is the real difference you have going on here. The French have this idea, and the Junocol, remember, is supposed to work on 2 streams. You have the small ships to flotilla defense, which is supposed to wipe out the enemy battle fleet and allow your armored cruisers, your protected cruisers and armored cruisers to go out and contest the world's trade and bankrupt a nation like Britain. Well, you have to hope for the French sake that fleet you destroy includes all the British cruisers, because the British already have cruisers in service which could hoover up these vessels. They could hoover them up. It's good on paper. It looks good. It looks amazing. It looks like the Junocol has this idea that's going to work, this two-stage plan, and yet this theory on paper, this persuasion, this idea, you're out of date already. So her advantage of Sfax is supposed to be speed. She can do 16.71 knots. The Leander class, 16.5 knots as designed, up to 18 knots after the funnels have been raised. Well, even at then their design speed, Sfax is not fast enough to get away. Yes, the 6-inch guns on the Leander class are not the most brilliant. They would have wanted to have more. They wanted to put them in various positions. They couldn't because of top weight, etc. But she still got 10 of them. Whereas the Sfax has 6. And that's the sort of thing which gives an advantage. And yes, the Sfax has 10 5.4-inch guns, which is going to allow a pretty high rate of fire. And that, combined with her 6-inch guns, is probably going to give them a firepower advantage over the Leander. But is that going to give them enough advantage when we compare that the armor for the Sfax is 30 millimeters, 1.2 inches, and for the Leander is 1.5 inches? It doesn't sound like a much bigger difference, but it means the armor's almost a third thicker. It's not a massive difference, but it's a lot thicker when you consider it's 1.5-inch armor on the gun shield, and Sfax doesn't have armored gun shields. As I said before, the problem for a commerce raider is that it always has a glass drawer. Yes, France has a far more of an advantage in that than Germany. They do have colonies around the world that can provide supplies. They can provide a place to repair, refit, rearm. But again, it's not inexhaustible. As said, the most French and the most cruiser of this cruiser period, the Sfax. And tomorrow, after this, it's going to be, of course, the Duca da Costa class, which are part of the Italian Condottieri class series, and then, of course, it'll be on to the next of this class, this 19th century cruisers period. So I hope you enjoy the videos going on. I hope you find them interesting. And also, lives we've got coming up this month. We have 11th, which is actually today as I'm recording this. Questions and answers on naval history till the brew runs out. 16th September, 5 ways to fix the fleets of World War II, 1941 to 42. That's a live discussion of those videos. 18th September, questions and answers on naval history till the brew runs out. 22nd of September, Patron 62, Daniel Freeman. What if the French Navy had left France and carried on the fight in 1940? It's an interesting one. I'm still not sure how much I'm going to discuss what might have happened in France if they had. 25th of September, Brew Ships 86. 29th of September, Patron 63. in-car escort carriers, the ideas and designs, development, and notable operations. That's going to be a fun one. That's going to rely on a couple of very interesting books. Annie, thank you very much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed, and I hope you found it useful. Thank you as ever for your support. I wouldn't be able to do any of this without you. So thank you to all the patrons, to all the subscribers, to all the super chats, super thanks. Thank you everyone. Thank you everyone who does the Ko-fi thing, and the people who've been very kindly sending me ideas, let alone support for the PC builder which I've got coming up, which hopefully will improve the quality of the videos. I do know there have been sound issues in things lately, and I think it's probably because I've had to keep moving stuff around, and it stops the system stabilizing. But my plan is to very much have a PC which is set up, constant, and so everything can stabilize and be happy. And then this will be my mobile gear, which I'll take around with me when I am traveling. So hopefully that will all work and the ideas will work well. It's a cross fingers. It's a historian approach. We'll hope it works. Thank you very much, everyone. Take care and have a nice evening.